Our last day, initially, it was going to be that last Sunday. And then a couple of weeks ago, I started thinking, well, maybe it needs to be the Sunday before, which would be next Sunday. And now I think it may be drifting back towards the last Sunday again. So basically, I'm completely confused about where I'm going to be next week and where Laura's going to be. But I think we've got it about figured out. We're getting closer. But we appreciate your presence and your encouragement and your prayers as we get through all this. And we're excited, obviously, but we're going to miss all of you. We'll miss. If you want to turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, actually just Ecclesiastes. We'll end up in Ecclesiastes 12, but we're going to work through the book. If you got a bookmark, that's pretty much where we're going to be in our lesson today. One of those lessons that I think we alluded to it a little bit on Wednesday night, but I want to get into a little bit more detail and spend a little bit more time on it today, because I think the question that Ecclesiastes answers is particularly important in our world, because it's the question that everybody asks, and that's the question: does God want me to be happy? If you asked, I think, anybody what they wanted most in their lives, particularly in our country, and what would describe the best life, most of them ultimately would essentially say, I want to be happy. I want to have the things and do the things that will make me happy. And they might add, I want to make other people happy too. We have a culture, I think, that's devoted to happiness. It kind of makes sense. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right there in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence. And what we've done over time, I think that language has shifted to the point where it's not so much that I have a God-given right to pursue happiness, but I have a God-given right to be happy in whatever way I may believe will make me happy. And so we've created this, it's almost a cult of self-help and self-love in our society, where we emphasize living our best life and not wasting our time and our energy on things that are negative or things that are going to bring us down, things that will make us feel unhappy. We surround ourselves with people who will enforce the view that whatever we do in our lives is good. I don't want to be around negative people. I want people who I'm happy to be around. If I'm not happy when I'm with you, I don't want to be a part of you. That's kind of how we create our circles. We seek out people who will affirm us and make us feel good about ourselves. And we're really good at that in this culture. The question is, why aren't we happy? We own more, we know more, we have more entertainment than we know what to do with. We have fewer limitations on our behavior than ever in history. And yet continually we see studies roll out that describes people, particularly in the United States, as generally being unhappy. And that brings us, I think, to the value of the book of Ecclesiastes. Why it's so important for us today, because it wrestles with this same issue that we're talking about, this question of, in fact, it's written for the purpose of trying to figure out how we can be happy in a world that seems designed specifically to keep us from being happy. At least it seems that way on the surface. It's written by someone who calls himself the preacher. I won't go into a lot of details on this, but essentially most people will argue that this is Solomon. There's more and more people today that are saying that Solomon didn't actually write this book, that it was written later on by someone claiming to be Solomon or writing in the voice of Solomon. But it's pretty clear that the book claims for itself, even if he never uses his name, the identity of Solomon. Ecclesiastes 1:12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. Okay, there's a lot of kings in Israel. Verse 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. That's not Solomon. I don't know who it would be. Verse 2, verse 9, he says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Even considering the poetic nature of books and exaggerations that often happen, pretty hard to imagine any other king or writer that would describe themselves in this way, claiming for themselves wisdom that God had only given to Solomon. And the argument in many cases that it's a scribe that's kind of assuming the identity of Solomon to give his words more weight later on. And typically the reason people make that argument, I think, is it's hard to square Solomon's advice with the way he actually lived. His conclusion in this book is fear God and keep his commandments, and yet Solomon lapsed into idolatry in his later years. But I don't think it's hard to imagine Solomon in writing this book, looking at his life towards the end of it, having given into the will of his wives and built these temples for him and succumbed to idol worship and compromising his beliefs and doing all these things that frankly don't seem like what he's talking about in Ecclesiastes or Proverbs. And looking back at his life maybe and saying, I know I've made mistakes and this is not how I should have lived. Even if I'm so entrenched in it now that there's no going back. He wouldn't be the first person to not practice what he preached. Safe to say. And it would appear to me that even after embracing idolatry, Solomon could still be used by God. God's wisdom still speaking through Solomon, even when he himself ignored it. And the writer clearly intends for us to see this book in this light. This is the wisdom that comes from God, not from human initiative. He says that at the end of the book, in the final chapter, and when he talks about in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 11, where it says, the words of the wise are like goads, like nails firmly fixed, are the collective sayings. They are given by one shepherd. One shepherd always. There's a lot of times when kings are referred to as shepherds. Other people are. When it talks about the one shepherd, it's always connected with the divine. It's always connected with God. Psalm 80, verse 1, example, when the writer says, give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth. The one shepherd is God. And maybe that adds a little bit more weight to Ezekiel's prophecy about the coming Messiah, over in Ezekiel 34:32, when he tells us, I will set up over them one shepherd. There's that same phrase. It's my servant David. Well, who is David? In this case, he's talking about Jesus, isn't he? The one shepherd. In fact, that's how Jesus describes himself in John 10. I am the good shepherd. Separated from all other shepherds, all of the leaders of Israel, current, past, and future. Because he is the one who is good, as God is good. He makes that point in Luke 18 and 19. Remember when the rich ruler comes to him and says, good teacher, what will I do to inherit eternal life? And his response is, what do you call me good? There's no one good but God. He's not saying I'm not good. He's saying, do you realize the implications of what you're saying here? That if I'm good, then that means I am fine in nature. And so we see this idea of Jesus as the good shepherd, and I think that's the idea that this wisdom that's been given, this book that has been given to us in Ecclesiastes, is God's wisdom for man. How can we live a good life? How can we find fulfillment in the world that will ultimately leave us feeling unfulfilled? And he provides, there's some similar directives over in Proverbs. If you remember Proverbs 2, at the very beginning, when he describes wisdom, and he says that if you want wisdom that is truly wisdom, the only place you can go to that is the one who created all things, the one who knows, the one who could direct our lives, because he is the source of our lives. In Proverbs 2, verse 6, he says, the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, watching over the ways of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. The world's always seeking wisdom. But inevitably, it always looks back on itself to provide it. How to make the world fair and just and good. And there's all kinds of ideas about how we can do that and how we can make ourselves happy. And the more convinced we are that we can achieve that, it seems like the farther it is that we fall short. If I want to understand life, how to live it in the best possible way, I need to go to God. And so that leads us back to that question. Does God want me to be happy? Well, I think sometimes we head this thing. Because a lot of times we'll say, well, the point is not about being happy. We're going to have difficulty. We're going to have heartache. We're not always going to be on top of the hill. Sometimes we're in the valley, right? And that's absolutely true. And we look at happiness as an emotion that is largely out of our control. And it's impacted by things that happen around us. And that sometimes, it's just not possible to be happy. And again, there's some truth to that. Because otherwise, why would we be calling, why would God call us to rejoice with those who rejoice? Weep with those who weep. Sometimes we're going to weep. Because things happen in our lives that bring us sorrow. And so sometimes we'll say, well, happiness really isn't the point. It's about being able to rejoice even when we aren't happy. It almost makes it sound you don't have to be happy to rejoice. There's some subtleties to that, but it almost makes us sound like the pictures we have of the Puritans. I need to research the Puritans one day. I'm absolutely convinced that the Puritans are not who they are represented. Because when we see a Puritan, what do we see? Grim-faced, serious, angry. If it's fun, you can't do it. No joy, just nothing happy at all about these people. I'm not sure that that's really what they were. Because I think the world always looks at this and says, how could you possibly live in the world and be happy if you're not enjoying the things that the world has to offer? They must have been miserable. I think Ecclesiastes makes the point that we can be happy in serving God because God does want us to be happy. He wants it so much that he gave us a book that tells us exactly how to be happy. But the point is not to tell us how we can be in a constant state of happiness. Never have a bad day, never have sorrow. The point that he teaches in this book is to look at life the way God looks at it, the way God designed it to function. Because as Solomon goes into this book, he describes the life that we lead when we try to make every moment a happy moment. When we view our lives as a constant pursuit of happiness, of fulfillment. He tells us that if we try to do that, we're going to come to the same conclusion that he came to when he tried all these things. If you read this passage, we're going to read the first about 15 verses or so of Ecclesiastes, because I think it's useful to see how he describes life. He says in verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All stream runs to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the stream flows, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It is already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. To sum all that up, what do we have? Nothing is new, nothing changes, nothing lasts, nothing fulfills, nothing answers. One of the reasons I'm confident Solomon wrote this book is that only Solomon could have credibly written this book. Because his conclusion is only valid if he truly did try everything. Because people will say, well, you can be happy, you just didn't have enough money. If you had enough money, you could buy whatever you wanted. Well, Solomon had everything he wanted. There's nothing in life that Solomon was denied. He had every resource, and then he had time to devote to every endeavor. And he truly had the wisdom to understand what he had accomplished. Solomon was wealthy. He lived in a time of peace. He had immense resources to do whatever he wanted. And so he creates these beautiful buildings and gardens, temples being the pinnacle of all that, things that would surely survive for centuries after he's gone. About laughter and celebration with wine, and that would bring him happiness in the moment. He amassed gold and other riches, slaves, possessions. He surrounded himself with entertainment and sensual pleasure of every single conceivable kind. He describes this hunt in Ecclesiastes 2:10. He says, whatever my eye desired, I did not keep from him. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, the striving for wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. That verse 10 sounds like the American dream, doesn't it? Everything, I didn't deny myself anything. And more, I think people are getting to that same conclusion that Solomon makes in verse 11. This is all vanity. I got everything I needed, and now I realize it doesn't make me happy. Solomon found a fundamental truth on this earth. Everything has an ending. It's a very real condition. I think I've mentioned this for a while back, called post-Everest syndrome. People who climb Mount Everest, or some other great challenging slope. And when they come back, there's this common feeling that these people have of depression and lacking of motivation in anything. And partly that's the change your body goes through. You shift from that daily struggle for survival back to a normal, non-dramatic environment. I'm not clinging to my last breath every moment. All of a sudden, it just seems mundane. And partly it's because you look around now and you realize that your life is still what it was. I accomplished this great thing. I climbed Mount Everest. Who can say that they did that? And then I get back home and nothing has really changed after all. Still the same person. Accomplishment's over. Where do I go from there? How do I top it? That's the next struggle. What can I do to get back up there? The fundamental reality of life. If I'm pursuing happiness by pursuing worldly accomplishments or fame or some other cherished goal in this life, it's always going to be empty in itself. But Solomon learned one meaningful key to happiness in this effort, and that was that he enjoyed his work. He got satisfaction from building, from creating, from involving himself in meaningful, important projects. But whenever he got to the end, the feeling was gone once the work was finished. Goals accomplished, nothing left. And his wisdom kicked in at that point in chapter 2, verse 18, where he says, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is also vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toils of my labor under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This is also vanity and great evil. What is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils around the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow. Sorry about this. Let me fix it. Trying to fix something and it wouldn't let me do it. So, Solomon's seemingly unlimited ability to hit that wall that every one of us faces. We're all going to die. It's all going to end, and I have to give it up to somebody else. And the irony is that Solomon builds this amazing temple, and he's wondering at this time, what's going to happen after I build it? This is amazing, but what happens after I die? Sure enough, he turned out to be right, didn't he? Because he turned it over to people who blasphemed and corrupted the temple, and eventually allowed it to get so bad that God came in and completely destroyed the whole thing. It was no longer of any, I can't even use this anymore. It's exactly what Solomon was worried about. Solomon's wisdom. Do I have assurance that it will remain after I'm gone? That's the one way that we can cheat death. If we can just kind of somehow manage to survive and have something that we've built that will remain here forever, our legacy. But even that, there's no guarantee of it. So even the joy of creating had been lost to him at this point. And so we're 2 chapters in, and we've established that nothing lasts and nothing matters. And it's no wonder that we sometimes get into Ecclesiastes and say, I don't want to read this book anymore. I get to chapter 3 and I'm done. This is depressing. But I would argue that if we keep going, Ecclesiastes can actually be a very positive book, depending on your perspective and depending on how you view the answers that Solomon comes up with. Because we go back to that question, does God want me to be happy? One of the problems I think we have in this question is what we really mean is, does God want me to pursue what I believe will make me happy? Does God want me to be happy in whatever it is that I decide to do with my life? In our culture, I think we tend to view the value of our lives in terms of whether I've got to spend it doing the things I wanted to do. And if you notice in the book of Ecclesiastes, a lot of the vanity that Solomon points out links to this idea. I'm trying to please me. I'm trying to live for me. I'm thinking about all the things that will make me happy. And so we target that. Whatever we think will work, and we pursue that. And when it doesn't work, we shift to something else that may seem different, but in reality, it's just a different form of the same approach to the problem. I find another worldly aspiration. I found that it has the same limitations as all the other ones do. Solomon introduces his realization here at the end of chapter 2, and it changes everything about his approach. It's intended to change our approach. Because Solomon realizes the thing which is so unfulfilling on the one hand can become fulfilling when I have a clearer perspective on my relationship with God. Because notice what he says in verse 24 of Ecclesiastes 2. He says, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. All the things that he just said were vanity. But what does he say? This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to one who pleases God. This is also vanity, the striving after wind. Solomon shows why I can't truly enjoy life apart from God. Unless I gave up the idea of trying to say, well, they seem like they're happy, but they say they're happy, but they're not really happy. I don't know that's true. I think that if you convince yourself that all you have in this life is the here and now, and that everything else, there's no real meaning other than just getting whatever I can out of it. If that's really what you believe, maybe there's a form of contentment that you can get in that, and maybe some people can embrace that, and that's fine with it. And maybe they can be happy in that moment. That's fine. Uh, I can't read people's minds, but we're not designed to live like that. We're not designed to find fulfillment like that. And my suspicion is that on those nights when they're lying awake, not able to sleep, and surrounded by everything that they've accumulated, I suspect that there's still that instinct that says there has to be something more than it. When we embrace that lifestyle, we're ignoring the lesson that God is trying to teach us. Because unless we actively try to suppress it, all of us know that we are not intended to live our life chasing experiential happiness. There's more to life. That's how animals live. And notice what he says in chapter 3. If you go down to chapter 3, verse 18, he makes this point. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. What happens to the children of man, what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? We have a desire to have meaning that outlasts the things of this life, and we can't accomplish that through anything that we accomplish through our own strength. And from that standpoint, we're no better than the animal. He basically just exists to eat, sleep, procreate, and eventually to die and be food for somebody. But I would argue that the lesson of vanity that Solomon learns here is not an empty lesson of pessimism and futility. The lesson of hope. Because if I have a hope for something eternal, why do I have that? I didn't create that. I didn't make that up. That's something God gave to me. It's an impulse that God put in me. And if God gave me this impulse, that tells me that God has a way that I can satisfy that impulse. And I think that's what he says in back in chapter 2, verse 24, where it says, there's nothing better for a person that should eat or drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. And he says this, he makes this point as we read this before. Solomon isn't teaching that we can't have lasting joy and happiness in our life. He's saying that when we are in submission to God, when we put our trust in God, when we are seeking first and foremost to serve God, content to accept God's gifts, not for what we want them to be, but for what God intended them to be, we can be content with that. We can be happy with that. We can truly rejoice in our lives on this earth because we know that we have meaning that we found beyond this life. There's a rhetorical question he asks in this passage we just read. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes up or goes down? I don't think the point is, Solomon, I believe, knew what happens to the spirit of man. That's not really what his point is making here. I think what he's trying to argue is that apart from God, as he says in verse 25, what assurances do we have? Point not in a literal sense. He talks about the sinner. The sinner basically has been given the task of gathering and collecting only to give to one who pleases God. I don't think the point is that if you're a sinner, your stuff's all eventually going to get taken away. That's not his point. His point is, at some point you're going to die, and you've got nothing. Everything that you labored for is going to be given to someone else. And ultimately, the person who has success in death, who has fulfillment in death, is the one who has something promised beyond the grave, which is what God's people get. The contentment and the confidence and the assurance of joy that God brings to his people when we continue fellowship and faith. So can I lead a happy and fulfilled life? Well, it depends on how we view life, doesn't it? Do I see it from the perspective of where I am right now? Maybe we talked about this Wednesday night, for those who were here. Maybe I just lost a loved one, or I'm ill or in pain and struggling with something in my life. And I'm thinking, I wouldn't wish this life on anyone. When we view our life from the valley, separate and apart from all the rest, we risk giving into despair, don't we? We have no hope that anything is going to get better. This pain is what my life is now. And you're looking and you've got the hill in front of you. All you see is the surface of the hill that you've got to climb now. All you see is the obstacle. And if I view it from the top of the hill, like the Mount Everest climbers, all I see is the downward slope. I can't stay up here. It only gets worse from here. And I start thinking about how I can't be here forever. And I'm focused again on the bad things. It's not how God sees life on this earth. Not how he calls us to look at life. In chapter 3, he gives us this great series of events and purposes in life. And he says, for example, in verse 1, he says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And I won't read through this whole list, but I think we're all familiar with it. But we see this list and we think to ourselves that there's a lot of places in here that are not happy places, that are not good places. And when it says in verse 11 of this chapter that God has made everything beautiful in its time, there's nothing beautiful about war. There's nothing beautiful about loss or death or some of these other things. And I think sometimes it's hard for us to understand. But the word that's used there for beautiful, it's an interesting word. It doesn't describe something as being beautiful in itself. In other words, he isn't saying God made killing beautiful or hate beautiful or mourning or any of those negative things. What he's saying is he's not saying you need to be happy when you're involved in these things. He's saying that God has made them to fit beautifully. That's the phrase this word means to be. He has made everything to fit beautifully in its time. And the idea is that they form something greater than the individual elements. When you think about how God works, isn't that kind of how it works? That's how God works in creation. That's how he works in the family. That's how he works in the church. That's how God works in life. The act of bringing together disparate, different parts that may not even have that much value or beauty in themselves, and arranging them in such a way that they create something that fulfills God's plan. And if I judge my happiness by whether I'm in that sweet spot, I'm going to struggle with that. But as a child of God, I can step back in my worst time and still see my life the way God sees it. And know that God isn't focused just on this momentary pain that I'm going through, which may not seem momentary, but he's focused on my life. He's focused on creating something in me that has eternal value. And Solomon spends the next 5 chapters showing us what life looks like when I don't see that. That's when it really gets grim in these next few chapters. He shows all the ways in which man fails to achieve fulfillment. And there's always this theme that what we seek to accomplish these things without God. It never works. We're always doomed to fail. Ecclesiastes 8, if you skip over a little bit, in verse 16, he says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the works of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it. Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it. Never truly going to understand my life apart from God. And so in chapter 9, we get to this crowning statement of despair, where he says in verse 1, all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hands of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner. And he who swears is him who shuns an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to us all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. When you read this sometimes, it almost sounds like Solomon is saying, Even the righteous have no, even being righteous doesn't matter. You can be the best person in the world and it's not going to make any difference. But the point I think he's trying to make is that if I'm trying to be happy on my terms, seeking all the things in this life, then all the righteousness in the world isn't going to help. Go to church every Sunday, give your offering every Sunday, present your worship. Eventually you go to your grave and you're no better off than the wicked person was. Because none of those things you aspired to are going to last. But there's an element of hope here, even if it sounds hopeless. He says if you have that mindset, it's still better to be alive than to be dead. Because that's not what he said earlier on. Back in chapter 4, he said in verse 2 of chapter 4, I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Better than both is he who has not been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. It's better to be dead than to be going through what this life has to offer. Because the despair he's been describing is the viewpoint of someone who's not seeking his happiness in the light of God. And what he says here is if you're still alive in chapter 9, there's still a chance to change your viewpoint. You can still embrace true wisdom to see where the real value in your life is. He doesn't specifically say this, but I think it's implied. The living know that they're going to die. And what should that should prompt? That should make me think about some things. Maybe change my life. And so in verse 7, he turns and addresses not the one from verse 5 and 6 who's rejected God, but the one in verse 7 who is still seeking God. So he tells that person, go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. All the days of your vain life that he has given to you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge of wisdom in the shield to which you're going. Because when you see your life as a gift from God, given to you for use in his service, for us to live a joyful life and a full life in his care, we can find joy and happiness in this world. Even when the world is struggling to find any meaning in life. Solomon argues that the only way we can truly do that is unexpected. He gives a message that maybe we don't expect in Ecclesiastes, and that is to live our lives optimistically. To expect that God will provide good for us even when the days are dark. Go down to chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1, what does he say? Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. That's not exactly Murphy's Law. Go fish, you'll get something. Give a portion to 7 or even 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south and the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. In other words, you can't control your life. You don't know what's going to happen. You cut the tree. Now, if you're really good at it, you can figure out where the tree's going to fall. But his point is, that if that tree falls, I don't know where it's going to fall. I just know it's going to fall somewhere. How am I going to deal with that? Difficulties are going to happen. Tragedies will occur. Are you living to redeem the time? Not to heap up treasures for yourself, as Jesus says, but to be a blessing for others. All worrying about those things does is hold our hands back from the good things that God has promised. That's the point he's trying to make. What are you worried about what's going to happen? Go do it. Go do what God has called you to do. Live the life he's called you to live. And don't worry about what the consequence is going to be in terms of this world. Verse 4, he says, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. In other words, I don't know. Like it might rain today, I better not go out. It reminds me of the proverb where he says, the sluggard says, there's a lion in the street, a lion in the street. I can't go outside and do anything because the lion might kill me. That's how my life is. There a lion there or not? That's kind of depends on whether I'm going to get up and do my work. That's not a way to live. He says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning, sow your seed, and in the evening, withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet. It's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that come is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Find joy in the life that God has given. Don't chase fulfillment in the things the world offers. Don't expect from this life things that this life was never intended to accomplish. But instead recognize the gifts of God and put them to work in his service. Because when you start seeing things in life as gifts that were given to you by a creator that wants you to enjoy them, as opposed to things that you're just supposed to have by virtue of being on this planet. And that's kind of how some people live. Like I have a right to whatever's going to make me happy, and if the world needs to give it to me, or it's just not being fair. When I start thinking about my life in terms of blessings, it's going to change everything. It can bring true happiness because that happiness isn't rooted in getting something. It's in the knowledge that someone who is beyond my ability to understand or comprehend, who created a universe, is still mindful of me, chosen to bless someone like me. Concludes this book in chapter 12, of course, with a statement that we probably always think about when we get to Ecclesiastes 12. Where he says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Am I happy? How do I be happy in God? I'm happy when I recognize that we have a purpose in this life. Problem is we just don't always want to accept that purpose. But we need to be living with purpose, living with confidence, and living with optimism. Understand that bad things happen in this world, but that we have something wonderful promised. God want me to be happy? Yes. God promised that I will always be happy? No. Does God offer a solution to my unhappiness? Yes. The solution is to be faithful to God, put our trust in him, and to set our hope on the one who has promised to come and bring us to heaven, raised from the dead. The lesson is yours this morning. Hopefully it's been useful for you. Hopefully it's encouraging. If you have any other needs of the saints, if you need to pray for you, you need to make your life right with God in some way, please let us know what we can do as we stand, as we're